Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm so sorry I can't be with you this afternoon. I was in Nanjing just a few days ago for a lecture, but then we had to move on to Shanghai, and now we're back in Beijing. But I'm delighted to be able to share with you some initial thoughts on Chinese music as ICH 20 years after the UNESCO Convention. As you all know, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the important 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. It was built on earlier UNESCO initiatives to preserve tangible heritage, like man-made physical structures, and it was a very courageous and challenging move to try to safeguard intangible cultural heritage, because it's intellectually and organizationally much more complicated than tangible heritage. While there have been many formal initiatives to safeguard ICH at local and national levels, predominantly in Asia, like Japan from 1950, but across the world, it has formed in myriad forms, and this was the first global effort on this particular scale. What did the 2003 convention add? I think what was very important is that it led to international awareness and much greater understanding of intangible cultural heritage, the concept and the fact that it existed and that was worth preserving. I think it was also important that there was a formal recognition of the value of specific traditions by independent international experts, however we may criticize the exact process. Then, of course, there was the acknowledging the need to safeguard, or rather, I prefer the word sustain, specific traditions in trouble. And at the very core of the convention was the recognizing of communities as the central players in music sustainability, at least in principle. And this continues to this very day. A recent press release welcoming San Marino to the convention spoke of a worldwide international network committed to supporting communities in the safeguarding of their living heritage. But have communities really been at the center? In the draft of the 2003 convention, um, communities were definitely empowered to decide on which traditions to put forward, how to plan for their support, and how to execute that support. But as the drafts went on, their role was much weakened in the final texts. So words went from communities decide, to communities advise, to communities are consulted, to communities are being informed. Norika Aikawa has written a fabulous essay on this. So in terms of the history of community in implementing the convention over the past 20 years, of course, a great deal has been achieved here in China and in many other nation states. But the tension between the perspectives and the ways of working of public authorities and those of the communities continue to create challenges in being true to the convictions at the heart of the convention, which is that the communities are the ones that decide and the culture bearers. So if we summarize the pros and cons of the first 20 years of the convention, definitely we have to say that the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage has been wildly successful in raising international awareness of music as ICH. 181 nation states have now signed up to this important convention, which is very, very high for any convention, and many have invested seriously in finding and recognizing diverse musical expressions, sometimes identifying ways to safeguard them. And China, as you probably all know, spends billions of RMB every year on its cultural diversity. On the con side, while it was recognized that ICH is rooted in community, we see everywhere that nation states rather than communities make selections and decisions, taking away agency from the people to whom the music means most. And this is a very, very serious issue. I think that at least as important in terms of concrete actions, it proved easier to approach music practices as things rather than as living traditions that are nurtured by an inconvenient complex of social, financial and economic factors. And this is really problematic. In this context, I would like to refer to a big project that I've run before called Sustainable Futures for Music Cultures. Working with musicians from all over the world, I found that everybody complains about how bad their life is, but very few of them analyze correctly what the problem is. So in many years of thinking about this, and then the big project from 2009 to 2014, we came up with the idea of a musical ecosystem. In this musical ecosystem, there are 5 different domains. One is musicians and communities, so how do communities engage with music and with those who make music? Another one is systems of learning music, How do people learn to make music, and what and where do they learn and how? Then there's infrastructure and regulations, which is about the hardware and the software of music, if you like. What buildings do you need, but also what rules are there which are either conducive or negative for the sustainability and vitality of any tradition. Then there's media and the music industry. What roles do the media, the record industry, and of course, particularly the internet play in dissemination and income generation? And this is going into an entirely new phase with the rise of AI, but I think it's too early to comment intelligently about that. After 5 years of looking at 9 different case studies across the world, we came up with a graph for any music practice being surrounded by an ecosystem of about 40 different forces that impact either positively or negatively on its sustainability. So in this graph, which is probably too small to read from where you're sitting, the top red balloons are musicians and communities, the orange ones are systems of learning music, the purple ones are infrastructure and regulations, the blue ones are media and the music industry, and the green ones are context and constructs. The forces that we see in each of those interact with the other domains. For instance, one of the things that we found is that prestige, the degree to which a particular music is valued, is very, very important for the sustainability of music. So if there's high prestige, which is in the green area, the communities will probably engage with the music. People will want to learn it in the orange area. The government and public authorities will be ready to build buildings or support infrastructure and subsidies, and the media are likely to engage with it either commercially or non-commercially. So a single factor can make its round around the different domains. Similarly, it's important to see that larger clusters of circumstances, for instance, caused by war or by COVID, impact many of the different domains. So describing a situation which has been impacted by a larger force requires anyone to carefully look at what happens in each of those domains because of a big event. So the question is, how do these contrasting approaches relate to China? China, as you know, China currently has 431 musical items on the national ICH list. There's 43 items that have been inscribed on the UNESCO ICH list, of which 15 are clearly related to music and a few other ones loosely related to music. Various scholars from China and abroad have monitored and reflected on the progress of this ambitious endeavor, including Helen Rees, Zhangbo Yuanjuai, and possibly most extensively Zhao Mei, whose report on progress and challenges after the ICH movement, which looks at the situation from 2014 to 2022, was published recently, as you can see in the picture. I just got a copy from her in Shanghai. So, if we look at the evaluations of 20 years of ICH in China, various scholars acknowledge issues in several of the 5 domains of the cultural ecosystem. For instance, there are at least 7 important forces surrounding it. We're talking about Gujin, including inheritors, government, schools, scholars, artists, media, and merchants. And the interplay between these 7 forces finally forms extremely complicated conditions for Gujin in contemporary China. And the rise of the consumer economy has also become an important factor. So here, in a single paragraph, you see references to to each of the 5 different domains. Some of the comments that she makes and others make, like about learning and teaching, are fairly neutral. Like there are 5 distinct living transmission trajectories in contemporary China for traditional music: native transmission, stage transmission, school transmission, new constructed folklore transmission, and new media transmission. These all come from the report. They don't come from the report, they come from the Oxford book that preceded the report. Then let's look at some of the issues that we see across the 5 domains. In the area of tradition and development, which is mostly in the green area of constructs and contexts, writing about the famous silk and bamboo from south of the river, Helen Rees observes that development implied using louder, modernized instruments, replacing local tuning systems with equal temperament, introducing European harmony, and adopting detailed scores, planning dynamic contrasts, and new compositions. This is in a forthcoming article that she shared with me. This is something we find in many different places and has been a real threat to sustainability of specific traditions. I worked quite a bit in Vietnam, where the director of the Conservatory of the National Academy of Music insisted that all the instruments are tuned in diatonic tuning, which of course is quite disastrous for some of the very specific traditions of other tunings. Another thing that Zhao Mei raises is about ritual music as a product. What she says is the performances centered on work of art stand for performances based on fixed composed works on stage for aesthetic purposes, created by professional composers and played by professional performers, while those centered on products have clear commercial purposes, with programs generally evolving around the consumerist need of audiences. There we see a very interesting shift from a ritual music going two ways away from of its own center, one towards art music, and the other one towards commercial music. A very important factor here in China seems to be the tensions between institutions and community. And I'm working with some people here about the implications of the inclusion of traditional musics in the conservatoires in their place. What I've noticed on many of my previous visits as well is that many conservatoires in China teach traditional musics, but their status seems to remain below that of Western art music. Interestingly, I have seen that often reflected in their physical position in the institution. In most of the conservatoires, opera was on the top floor, the most prestigious floor, then came piano, then orchestral strings, woodwinds, and percussion, and traditional music tended to be housed in the basement of the building or in an older building next to the main building. These are very important things to think about, and also quite surprising because China has never been colonized, and still Western music has taken such a completely superior position in the musical mind of many of the Chinese people. Zhao Mei notices a number of shifts in transmission. From her work, she concludes from investigating 11 performing genres that the conflict between the institution of individual inheritors and the practice of communalized participation in most traditional arts in China clearly emerged. Originally passed on collectively has now become passed on individually. So she sees major changes in transmission systems. And I've written quite extensively on transmission systems before and noticed that these are much more important than we sometimes give credit to in terms of moving a tradition from one generation to the next. A very interesting factor in constructs is something that Gao Shu told me about, that when traditional musicians in various regions know that they will be visited by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, they change their performance to what they think is expected of them, rather than playing the music that they value and their communities values and in the way that it is valued. So there's such a strong change in such a strong awareness that the government decides what a tradition should sound like, that people try to predict how it's supposed to sound. Helen Rees has a very interesting article on the adventures of Chinese folk song. First, she critiques China's original ecology folk song movement as a reaction to the professionally recomposed folk songs that dominated the airways in the latter part of the 20th century, now saturating the country's popular and scholarly media for the last decade, reaching hundreds of millions of TV viewers and internet users. Performance and discussion of the songs point to rising concern over perception of rapid culture loss. So we've all seen how Chinese folk song has been repackaged and rebranded in different ways. Helen quotes Zhao, who presents the view that Chinese folk song has been threatened by processing and modification, by rejection and marginalization, by events such as the Cultural Revolution, during which most traditional culture was banned, and by cultural ecology pollution, which I think is a fantastic term which I've not come across in any other culture, since the economic opening of the 1980s, with the headlong rush to modernize, the craze for pop songs, and the rise of tourism. And many of us, of course, have been worried about the formats that has led to. Um, Ecology is a very popular word in China, but the ecology trope has not only um, created negative ideas. One of the initiatives that I've come to know, which I find really quite interesting and very promising on a world scale, is the National Cultural Ecosystem Conservation Areas, in which musical practice, community, and natural environment of the tradition are protected in cohesion, so like an ecosystem. In the words of the documents, it talks about people, item knowledge systems, and cultural, natural, historical background. And this is a very promising way of dealing with living traditions by making sure that the ecosystem of the living tradition stays in place rather than treating the tradition as a thing or as a product or a museum piece. There's many challenges, but there's much and ongoing work and evaluation to protect music as ICH in China. An overview of the 5 domains shows that there are pronounced challenges in the status of much traditional music, in dealing with forms of presentation, and with community sustained audience development, which I think is a very important factor. But perhaps the greatest challenge lies in the realm of agency. The support of traditional music is almost entirely in the hands of governmental entities, while research into cultural ecosystems strongly suggests that music that is owned, valued, and controlled by communities gives them greater resilience and much greater chances of continuing to exist. In conclusion, I think we can all quite comfortably say that China leads the way in investing in its music as ICH and has created elaborate and well-organized ways to implement this. However, the cultural ecosystem framework strongly suggests that the systems in place to do so must be constantly monitored for both their short-term and long-term effectiveness, particularly in relation to processes of change and transmission, the tensions between communities and institutions, and building real and lasting interest among the people so that new audiences can continue to engage with China's rich musical heritage. I think the latter is probably the most concerning factor at the moment. So, what we have seen with many musics across the world, you can artificially keep them alive by investing a lot into them. But then when the funding falls away, there's a great risk that the entire tradition falls flat. In the Sustainable Futures project that I mentioned before, we looked both at Western opera and at Indian classical music, North Indian classical music, Hindustani music. And in the end, we concluded that Hindustani music is probably more robust and vital than opera is, because if opera loses its funding, and we've seen with some orchestras that funding is not necessarily a given, even though much of the Western and much of the Asian world still thinks that Western classical music is a superior music for reasons beyond my understanding. But in India, the traditions are carried by many small communities. So there are many festivals in India, and they are supported by local people. So while eradicating opera would include closing off 3 major funding streams and access to facilities. In India, it would be almost impossible because it's very much grounds up from music circles, which are very small musical communities, to the festivals that are happening on sports fields where a stage is built and it's funded by the local people. Also, the esteem, India and China are very interesting to compare. The esteem in which Indian classical music is held is much higher than the esteem in which traditional music from China is held. Although India was colonized, Western classical music never got a foothold there. And by very carefully linking the traditional music with the nationalist agenda from the beginning of the 20th century, in the Indian awareness, Indian classical music is the best music in the world, very much like many Europeans believe that Western classical music is the best music in the world. In fact, one of my Indian colleagues, when we were talking about non-Western music, he said, so Mozart is non-Indian music. So the matter of perspective is really very important. And I think here in China, from my initial observations, I've only been coming here regularly for about 10 years, is that at the level of constructs of values and attitudes, there's still a great deal of work to be done, both in thinking what is tradition and what is innovation and what is worthwhile within the music, and in making sure that the communities stay connected to their music and that the audience at large understands what the music is. And we've seen good examples of this. Helen Rees has written about the Gujin craze that has started around the turn of the century. The productions of folk songs are very interesting, but they're also very dubious in the sense of what exactly do we preserve and who values what is being preserved. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of fabulous work going on already, and I'm really looking forward to looking more into many of these things. I'm sorry I'm coming to you by video, but um, my internet connection here is quite dubious, so I thought it would be better to do it in this way. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will try to be with you for any questions that you have.